In the autumn of 1527, Cardinal Wolsey threw a banquet at Hampton Court Palace for the French ambassadors, and the second course alone featured more than 100 sculptures made entirely of sugar. There were castles and knights on horseback, jousting with tiny spears, ladies dancing, soldiers firing miniature crossbows, a complete scale model of St. Paul's Cathedral, and a working chess set so detailed that the French had it boxed up and shipped back to Paris as a gift for their king. That was just dessert. The actual meal, the meat and the game, and the pies and the sauces had already been going for 2 hours. That is the world you're walking into. Tudor England, 1530, the court of Henry VIII, and you've somehow landed an invitation to a royal banquet. You might assume the hard part would be the food, the strange meats, the heavy sauces. It's the truly baffling idea that a peacock should be roasted and then redressed in its own feathers and paraded into the hall with its beak painted gold. And yes, the food would present a problem, but it would not be your biggest one. A Tudor royal banquet was not a meal. It operated as a 3-hour performance of politics, ceremony, and slow-acting dietary poison served on pewter plates that leached lead into your wine, while the Spanish ambassador 2 seats over recorded every word you said about the king's marriage. You were being fed, entertained, surveilled, and quietly killed by your own dinner, all at the same time, and you had to smile through every minute of it, because the king was watching. Picture where you are. 39-year-old Henry VIII stands 6'2" and still carries a 32-inch waist and a 39-inch chest. That bloated, swollen figure you're imagining belongs to a different decade, to the years after a jousting accident in 1536, that may have changed his personality forever. The Venetian ambassador Justinian once called Henry the handsomest potentate I ever set eyes on, and in 1530, that description still holds. Athletic, charming, and sitting at the center of the most dangerous political crisis in English history. Since 1527, Henry had been fighting to annul his 20-year marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and the Pope refused to cooperate. The Reformation Parliament opened in November 1529, and Cardinal Wolsey, the man who built Hampton Court, who ran those legendary banquets, who functioned as the second most powerful figure in England, had just been stripped of the chancellorship. An arrest for treason would come in November 1530, followed by death from dysentery at Leicester Abbey on the 29th, where Wolsey reportedly told the abbot, "Had I but served God as diligently as I have served the king, he would not have given me over in my grey hairs." That is the atmosphere. You are attending a feast thrown by a king who is systematically dismantling his own church, whose former chief minister is dying in disgrace, and whose not-yet wife, Anne Boleyn, occupies the queen's seat at the table, while the actual queen weeps 7 miles away at Richmond Palace. Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, sits somewhere in the hall. He refuses to call Anne Boleyn by name, it referring to her only as the lady or the concubine in his dispatches to the Holy Roman Emperor. Every glance at the seating chart, every whispered conversation, every toast goes into his reports. And you are eating dinner next to all of this, where a wrong opinion on what the court calls the king's great matter, expressed casually between the chine of beef and the marchpane, could end your career or something worse. But you've made it to the table, so let's talk about what's on it. Forget everything you think you know about medieval dining. That 14 courses number gets thrown around constantly, and it is wrong. A Tudor royal banquet ran to 2 courses, sometimes 3 on the grandest occasions. But each course contained 15 to 40 separate dishes. When I say 2 courses, I do not mean a salad and an entree. But I mean 2 successive waves of culinary violence, each one large enough to feed a small village, paraded into the hall by a procession of 15 or more dish-bearers. The Eltham Ordinances of 1526 laid out the king's own menu, and the first course alone specified bread, beer, ale, wine, pottage, chinas of beef, venison in broth, red deer, veal, custards, and fritters. A second course followed with jelly, hippocras, almond creams, pheasant, heron, bittern, spoonbill, cocks, plovers, gulls, larks, rabbits, venison pie, tarts, and more fritters. And that was a standard dinner, not a feast day, just a Tuesday. The Oxford humanist Thomas Starkey, writing around 1529 to 1532, just observed that nobles felt dishonoured if they have not at dinner and supper 20 dishes of diverse meats, which meant that anyone at Henry's table understood the quantity of food as a direct measurement of the host's honour, and by extension, their own worth in his eyes. Henry's kitchen accounts list roughly 30 species of wild fowl, including swan, peacock, crane, stork, bustard, quail, lapwing, oystercatcher, 3 species of gull, curlew, and blackbird. If it had feathers and the poor judgment to fly over England, it ended up on the menu. Each peacock went through an entire production. The bird was skinned whole, roasted, and then redressed in its own iridescent plumage with its beak and claws gilded for display. Swans, all property of the crown, arrived in a sauce made from their own blood. And the cockentrice, what the signature showpiece of the Tudor kitchen, combined the front half of a suckling pig sewn to the back half of a capon, stuffed, roasted, and presented as a single fantastical animal. The humour of the era, apparently, ran to taxidermy, and that only covered meat days, because roughly half the calendar year, Wednesdays, Fridays, Saturdays, plus Lent, Advent, and Ember days, were fish days by law. A single fast day meal for Henry and Catherine in 1526 opened with soup, herring, cod, lampreys, pike, salmon, whiting, haddock, plaice, bream, carp, trout, crabs, lobsters, and also porpoise and seal. The medieval church classified aquatic mammals as fish, a ruling that tells you everything about the flexibility of theological reasoning when the king wants to eat a marine mammal on a Friday. But all of this food poured out of a kitchen complex that operated as an industrial facility. 55 rooms spread across roughly a quarter of Hampton Court Palace, employing about 200 men, producing up to 800 meals twice a day, for a court that swelled to 1,200 people when you counted servants. 6 open fires roasted joints of beef simultaneously, while the great boiling cauldron held 80 gallons and the largest pastry oven stretched 12 feet across. The annual wood bill alone ran to approximately 1.3 million logs. 16 sub-departments kept the operation running: the bakehouse, cellar, a catery, pastry, scullery, larder, pantry, spicery, saucery, buttery, wafery, confectionery, boiling house, scalding house, poultry, and ewery, each staffed with its own sergeant, clerk, purveyor, and up to 21 workers. 3 master cooks ran separate kitchens for king, queen, and court. Down at the roasting fires, 7 spit-turning boys received extra ale rations to keep them cool, and scullions slept in the kitchens on straw. Henry personally ordered those scullions to stop going about naked or in garments of such vileness as they do now, which is one of those details that reminds you these were real people doing real work at industrial scale, in brutal heat, often without clothes, all for the king's dinner. To appreciate the scale of what you're eating, consider the annual provisioning lists. Every year, the Tudor court consumed roughly 1,240 oxen, 8,200 sheep, 2,330 deer, 760 calves, 1,870 pigs, and 53 wild boar, over 14,000 large animals a year, plus countless chickens, larks, pigeons, and wildfowl. A single day's supply for the king's travelling household, en route to Calais in 1532, listed 6 oxen, 8 calves, 40 sheep, 12 pigs, 132 capons, 7 swans, 20 storks, 34 pheasants, 192 partridges, 56 herons, 720 larks, 240 pigeons, and 24 peacocks. That was one day for a travelling party. The annual cost of feeding the court ran to about £20,000, which translates to roughly £6 million in modern money. But here's the thing. We haven't even gotten to the drinking yet, and that is where this story gets genuinely staggering. 600,000 gallons of ale and 75,000 gallons of wine. That is what the court consumed per year. 600,000 gallons of ale alone fills an Olympic swimming pool. Nobody at this table sipped politely, because the standard daily ration for a courtier across 16th century elite households ran to 6 to 10 pints of beer per person per day. Water did exist at court, piped 3 miles to Hampton Court from clean springs at Coombe Hill, and historian Martin Cornell has shown that rural spring water was usually safe to drink. What was deadly was London's water, which made ale and wine the rational default for anyone living near the Thames. And this is where it gets worse, because it was not the weak, watered-down, small beer that people assume. The Food Cult Research Project at Trinity College Dublin recreated Tudor beer from period recipes and measured the alcohol content at 4.4 to 5%, comparable to a modern premium lager. 6 to 10 pints a day of something roughly as strong as a Heineken, every day as a baseline. Wine arrived mostly from Gascony, delivered by barge up the Thames to a cellar at Whitehall that measured 70 by 30 feet and received about 300 barrels a year. Henry favoured claret, Rhenish, Burgundy, Anjou and Malmsey from Madeira. And at the close of every banquet came the hippocras, red wine warmed and sweetened with sugar and spiced with cinnamon, ginger, cloves and grains of paradise, served alongside pressed wafers stamped with the royal arms. Wolsey's great banquet for the French in 1527 produced one of history's more theatrical toasts, the cardinal arriving straight from hunting, still in boots and spurs, grabbing a golden bowl of hippocras worth 500 marks and calling out, "I drink to the king, my sovereign lord and master, and to the king, your master." £3,000 a year kept that cellar stocked, roughly £1 million in modern money. You are eating more food than you've ever seen and drinking more alcohol than your liver can process, surrounded by the most politically dangerous people in England. And none of that matters, because we haven't discussed the part where it's all slowly killing you. A Tudor courtier took in roughly 4,500 to 5,000 calories a day, more than twice what modern guidelines recommend. Those calories arrived almost entirely as red meat, game, offal, fat, sugar, and alcohol. Vegetables belonged to peasants in the Tudor worldview. The educated classes genuinely believed, on medical authority, that raw fruit caused diarrhea and fever, and that green vegetables engendered wind and melancholy, so they ate almost none. What followed from this diet was a nobility riddled with gout, scurvy, and kidney disease. A jousting wound Henry first sustained in 1527 opened again in 1536 and developed into crippling leg ulcers that never healed for the rest of his life. Contemporaries reported that the stench could be smelled 3 rooms away. And then there was sugar. Conical loaves imported from Madeira, the Canaries, Cyprus, and North Africa commanded roughly 10 pence a pound, about 12.5 pounds in modern money. Courts classified sugar simultaneously as a spice, a medicine, and an art material, which made it the ultimate status symbol, and it was destroying the teeth of everyone rich enough to afford it. Elizabeth I, Henry's own daughter, that would eventually be described by the German traveller Paul Hentzner in 1598 as having teeth gone black, a defect the English seem subject to from their too great use of sugar. But the habit had already taken hold by 1530, and skeletal evidence published in the British Dental Journal confirms that Tudor elite teeth were significantly more decayed than those of peasants. Bad teeth in Tudor England signalled wealth, because the poor could not afford to rot. Your tableware created its own quiet danger. Middle and lower tables at Hampton Court ate off pewter, with silver gilt reserved for the high table only, and antique pewter could contain up to 40% lead alloy. Acidic wines and sauces leach lead readily from those surfaces, and excavated pewter from the Mary Rose, Henry's warship that sank in 1545, bears the marks of working London pewterers, which means this is not speculation, but archaeology. The popular claim that English wine was routinely sweetened with lead acetate at this period does not hold up well. That practice appears documented for ancient Rome and parts of continental Europe, and a German physician named Eberhard Gockel only formally identified it as a toxin in 1696. But chronic low-level lead exposure from pewter tableware and lead-glazed ceramics was real, constant, and completely invisible to anyone living through it. Dysentery, the bloody flux, killed Wolsey himself in November 1530. His servants recorded that the matter that he avoided was wondrous black. Just 2 years before, in 1528, the sweating sickness, possibly a hunter virus, had broken up Henry's court entirely. Anne Boleyn caught it at Havre and recovered, but her brother-in-law William Carey died. The French ambassador du Bellay described the epidemic with a bluntness that still lands 5 centuries later, writing that this disease is the easiest in the world to die of, because if you uncovered yourself even slightly, you were taken off without languishing. At a banquet, shared cups, communal salt cellars, and dishes where everyone reached in with bare fingers, turned hospitality into a delivery system for disease. And that brings us to the etiquette, because if you somehow survived the food, the drink, the lead, and the politics, you could still destroy yourself by picking up the wrong piece of bread. That popular image of Henry VIII gnawing a turkey leg and hurling bones at a dog bears no resemblance to reality. Tudor table manners were intricate and strictly enforced through manuals like Wynkin de Ward's Boke of Kerving, published in 1508, which codified hundreds of rules. Never put meat into the salt cellar. Take salt only on a clean knife tip. Never return chewed bones to the shared dish, but drop them in the voiding bowl. Keep the tablecloth clean, empty, and wipe your mouth before drinking. Do not speak with your mouth full. Do not pick your teeth with your knife, and place your napkin over the left shoulder, which was popularly said to ward off the devil who sat there. Seating arrangements functioned as political documents. Tables formed a 3-sided U, with a great salt cellar, often a jeweled silver ship a foot or more tall, marking the divide between honored guests above the salt and lesser ones below. Henry sat alone at a covered high table on a raised dais under a canopy of state, while food arrived in messes of 3 or 4 dishes shared between 4 diners. The highest-ranking person helped themselves first, and no one touched food meant for someone else's mess. Every diner ate with their fingers, a spoon and a personal knife brought from home, because forks did not exist at an English banquet in 1530, except for Henry's own, which he used only for sweet preserves. Service followed a script precise enough to be choreography. The carver stood with a towel around his neck and a napkin folded on his left shoulder, while the sewer, the chief server rather than the underground pipe, waited with at least 6 gentlemen and yeomen until the usher bellowed the command. A procession of 15 or more dish-bearers then moved from kitchen to great chamber, met at the door by another usher, and presented dishes in strict sequence. 3 officers served the king on bended knee, the carver, the server, and the cup-bearer, while a taster performed the assay, sometimes touching food with what the court called a unicorn's horn, which was in fact a narwhal tusk, believed to detect poison. Between courses, basins of herb-scented or rose-scented water arrived with linen towels so every diner could rinse their fingers. After the final dish, tables were voided, and the company sat on for a closing course of hippocras, wafers, comfits, and marchpane in a separate chamber or garden pavilion. That closing course was, technically, the actual banquet, and everything before it counted as just dinner. Behind the king's table stood a 6-tiered stepped display called a cupboard of plate, exhibiting rows of silver-gilt cups, flagons, and chargers with the top tier in pure gold. None of it was for use. All of it existed for foreign ambassadors to count. The hall itself broadcast power through sheer architecture, because Hampton Court's Great Hall, which Henry began building in 1532 and demanded finished by candlelight at night, so impatient was he, stretched 106 feet long, 40 feet wide, and over 60 feet high under a hammer-beam roof that would eventually carry Anne Boleyn's falcon badge and her entwined initials. It was the last medieval Great Hall built for an English monarch. 58 court musicians at the height of his reign, including sackbuts, shawms, viols, lutes, recorders, and trumpets, played from a gallery above the hall. Yet Henry's personal instrument collection tells its own story. 78 flutes, 76 recorders, 10 trombones, 14 trumpets, and 5 bagpipes. Trumpets sounded the arrival of each course. Masques and interludes interrupted the meal. And at one Christmas entertainment in 1527, Henry himself crashed a Wolsey banquet disguised as one of 12 shepherds wearing garments of cloth of gold and satin. And the food you didn't eat did not go in the bin. Your plate was most likely a trencher, a thick square of 4-day-old stale bread, and by the end of the meal it sat saturated with gravy and grease. Those trenchers were collected and given as alms, while bones, scraps, and broken meat went into a large basket called a voider and passed to the almoner, whose department distributed them at the outer court gate to the poor who gathered there every day. The Eltham ordinances left no room for ambiguity on this point. All fragments were to be saved and gathered by the officers of the almonry and from day to day given to poor people, without diminishing, embezzling, or purloining any part thereof, and throwing dish leavings out a chamber door counted as a punishable offence. A Tudor royal banquet in its own way also operated as a welfare system, with one of the richest tables in Europe feeding scores of London's poorest every evening. That complicates the gluttony narrative, at least somewhat. Now step back and look at the full picture. To survive a Tudor royal banquet in 1530, you would need to eat roughly 5,000 calories of meat and sugar without visible discomfort, or drink somewhere between 6 and 10 pints of beer, as strong as modern lager, along with several cups of spiced wine, without falling off your bench, navigate a seating chart that functioned as a minefield of political allegiance during the most volatile constitutional crisis in English history, and follow several hundred rules of table etiquette, flawlessly using only your fingers, a spoon, and a knife you brought yourself, all while being served on bended knee, watched by ambassadors and entertained by trumpets, disguised kings, and sugar sculptures of cathedrals. And if you managed all of that, if you ate the right foods and drank the right toasts, and sat in the right seat and said the right things about the king's marriage, and wiped your mouth before drinking, you would go home that evening having taken in more lead, more purines, or more sugar, and more alcohol than your body was designed to process. And you would do it again the next day, and the day after that, and every day for the rest of your career at court, which, statistically, would not stretch as long as you might hope. The food didn't kill you at dinner, it killed you over decades. Sugar rotted your teeth black, purines gave you gout, lead accumulated in your bones, and alcohol pickled your liver. The politics, on the other hand, could kill you at any speed they liked. George Cavendish, Wolsey's gentleman usher, and the man who left us the most detailed banquet description that survives, wrote of the great French feast at Hampton Court, that the service arrived in such abundance, with such music, that the French seemed wrapped into paradise. Paradise served on pewter, sweetened with sugar, but washed down with lead-laced wine, and watched by a king who would, within 5 years, behead the woman currently sitting in the Queen's chair. You could attend a Tudor royal banquet, but surviving one was never really the point.